You're all very welcome back. The conclusion of the symposium today features a live discussion, participative conversation between Amr Kangizer and Jack Halberstam. And together their presentation, discussion and prompts explore the aesthetics of refusal through ideas of collapse, abandonment and abolitionary listening. So welcome, Amr. Welcome, Jack. We've been talking on email, but this is the first time I've seen you both face to face. So it's very, very nice to see you, if not to be present with you. So I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. So both our speakers have 20 minutes to present, followed by hopefully about 20 minutes for discussion, Q&A from the audience, which I'm going to be moderating. And just to remind the audience then that's joining us on the live stream that you can contribute to the discussion through the Telegram channel. So just click join discussion at the link below your stream. So our schedule, our lineup is going to be Jack, followed by Amr. And I just wanted to, let you both know as well, I'll just be keeping time. So I might give you even just like a peace sign or a 2-minute sign, sort of when you're coming up to 2 minutes, and maybe a T for when we're at 20 minutes. Just to make sure, basically, that we have time for both of your presentations and also so for some, fruitful discussion afterwards. I'm also going to be doing the slides for you guys, and I think you're both sharing images, so you can just let me know when you'd like me to move forward or back, if that sounds okay. So I might go ahead and introduce you both now. So Jack Halberstam is Professor of American Studies and Ethnicity, Gender Studies and Comparative Literature at the University of Southern California. Halberstam is the author of 5 books. I'm sorry?
That's not right. I'm
sorry. Go ahead.
a professor of English and the director of the Institute for Sexuality and Gender at Columbia University.
Oh, apologies. Your bio must be out of date. I'm very, very sorry. Thanks for clarifying. I also wanted to mention that Jack is the author of 5 books. I've had the pleasure of teaching a number of them at undergraduate and postgraduate level every year, including Skin Shows, Gothic Horror and the Technology of Monsters at Duke University Press, Female Masculinity, also Duke, In a Queer Time and Place by NUI Press, The Queer Art of Failure at Duke University Press, and Gaga Feminism, Sex, Gender and the End of Normal by Beacon Press, and has written articles that have appeared in numerous journals, magazines and collections. And I believe you're working on several projects at the moment, including a forthcoming book. Is that correct?
I just published a book called Wild Things, and I'm working on another one called Unworlding.
Unworlding, right, absolutely. And then I'd just like to introduce you to Amr Kangizer. Amr is an award-winning geographer, sound artist, and Marie Curie Research Fellow in Geography at the Royal Holloway, University of London. And they work through listening and attunement to approach the relations between people, places, and ecologies, combining oral testimony, poetry and voice with hyper-detailed soundscapes and field recordings to create immersive installations and radio art pieces. And they're the author of Experimental Politics and the Making of Worlds, which was published in 2013, and Between Sound and Silence, Listening Towards Environmental Relations, which is, I believe, is forthcoming. And they've published in a range of interdisciplinary journals, including South Atlantic Quarterly and Wire's Climate Change. Their audio work has been commissioned by a whole range of forums, including Documenta, BBC, ABC Radio National, Museum of Modern Art Warsaw, the National History Museum of London, Art Centre Melbourne, MACBA, Club Transmediale Festival, Rewire Festival, Sonic Acts, and Radio del Museo Reina Sofia and Deutschland Radio, among others. And the radio art piece, And Then the Sea Came Back, was jury nominated for the 2017 Prix Arts Electronica. And they've been featured in international arts and music publications, including The Wire, Adventures in Sound and Music, Quietus, and Transmediale. So, welcome again, Jack and Amr. And Jack, I'm going to hand over to you now. So, as I said, you just let me know if you want me to change the slides, and I'll just begin with your title slide.
Okay. But in between, we don't have to see the slide, right? So why don't we take the slide down and then I can see myself for the moment. Okay, that's better. Okay, so I have about 20 minutes, and what I want to do is just present some pieces of a geography that I believe registers with an anarchist politics of refusal, and which is very much, the theme of this event. And the reason that one might want to invest in a politics of refusal is that it kind of slows down the propulsive forward motion of many conventional political projects and stops us from leaping immediately to a sort of ethics of repair. And I've been thinking about Bonnie Hoenig's new work on a feminist politics of refusal, and then, of course, Amer's own work on refusal, negation, silencing. All of those things are sort of I'm working with in this new project on unworlding. In the book before this, I had thought about wildness as a kind of ambivalent source of power that is both part and parcel of colonial governance systems, the production of both a civilizing discourse on the one hand and the sort of negative production of a wildness that needs to be tamed on the other. And I read wildness within the context of the early 20th century as an ambivalent source of both rule and resistance. But in the new project, I'm going less back to the beginning of the 20th century and more back to the 1970s, where I believe the politics of refusal was, part and parcel of an emergent radical project that was organized around a sort of anarchist sensibility, and that took as its project and practice not the invention of another world, but the dismantling of this one. And it's that project, that idea, that we should be trying to figure out how to take apart the ideological system that we call world that preoccupies me at the moment and that I'll present on today. So if we look at the first slide, I'm going to start with a contemporary artist before going back to the 1970s. And this is a painting by Black artist Adam Pendleton, who has a show at the moment at MoMA. And Pendleton is most known for an amazing book called Black Dada, in which he refuses a politics of sense-making that in many ways can be identified as part of a system of white supremacy. So what counts as sense within a system of white supremacy is a set of racist logics that get articulated and re-articulated through aesthetics, through the everyday, through political languages and so on. This painting, you can see, is a riot of language and space, if you like. It's like Carol Walker's work. It sets up a relationship between lettering and the blankness of a page or a canvas. It articulates itself in black and white, and the words that you may or may not be able to read upon the canvas are "we are not." And it's so this first my first example for today, and all of these are just little examples I'm offering up on behalf of a conversation that I hope we're going to have. The first word that I would use therefore is negation. We are not. And this is a kind of resistance to an identity politics that presumes a certain kind of functionality between being, articulating political outcome, and so on, and instead is interested in taking apart ontologies and epistemologies of power. Without making a particular commitment to Afro-pessimism, I think that Adam Pendleton's world unmaking work can be thought of through the contribution of thinkers like Kelvin Warren, who in Ontological Terror proposed, quote, "There is no solution to the problem of anti-Blackness. It will continue without end as long as the world exists." So I hope you can hear, if we click out of the slide now, come back out of the slide, thank you. I think you can hear, therefore, in Warren's quotation, that world is already part of the logic of a white supremacy. And in order to counteract the world that has been built to the measure of racism, sexism, homophobia, and so on, we have to invest in slogans like "we are not." And Warren continues on to say, Black freedom constitutes a form of world destruction. So that's my first salvo, if you like, is to make common cause with a Black project of negation that understands world within the discourse of white supremacy and proposes end of world as a reasonable way of articulating an anti-racist politics. Okay, next slide then. My second vocabulary term is abandonment. And for this idea of abandonment, I'm giving you a slide that illustrates a brilliant book by Scottish journalist Cal Flynn, who went around the world looking for spaces that had been abandoned by humans. And this particular image is of an island off the coast of northern Scotland called Swona, where one family lived on this island for a long time. And when they died off, no one replaced them. It's a sort of uninhabitable, windswept place. And the cattle that they had raised there became feral. And so Flynn goes to places like Swona, but also other places that have been abandoned because of colonial ruination, other places that have been destroyed by pollution and toxicity. And she does so in order to think about the possibility of rewilding. And she writes, "We are in the midst of a huge self-directed experiment in rewilding. Because abandonment is rewilding in a very pure sense, as humans draw back and nature reclaims what once was hers, on a grand scale, this happens while no one was watching." And she calls this process of rewilding an extremely exciting prospect, but pulls back from romanticizing it, reminding us that some of these sites, like Chernobyl, have been the terrain for incredible, globally impactful chemical disasters. So these are not romantic places. These are places of ruination, but they are places that in the wake of human withdrawal, something else can happen. And she gives us in the book a sense of what that something else looks like. But I think abandonment is a really useful concept. And we can come out of the slide now, if you like, for a moment. I think abandonment is a really useful concept because it allows for us to at least indulge the intellectual experiment of imagining the world without us, without humans. And so I'm not arguing for abandonment so much as asking what happens when humans are out of the way and unworlding processes are unleashed upon these terrains. Okay, next slide, please. And I'm just about halfway through here. In this work on the 70s, so those were two examples: negation, which is very much connected to a kind of Black politics that has sometimes been identified as Afro-pessimism, and then abandonment as very much a part of a kind of Anthropocene set of questions about the impact of human presence and the potentiality that lies within human absence. But for the next pieces, I want to dip into the archive that I'm assembling from the 1970s. And this photograph is by a Black gay photographer, Alvin Baltrop, who I've been writing a lot about. And he has been mostly sort of championed for the images that he made in the 1970s of gay men cruising in the abandoned piers on the west side of New York City. And this is now a very hallowed ground for queer history. The idea that in the pre-AIDS period, gay men occupied these spaces that in a post-industrial era had been abandoned and had been therefore turned into playgrounds. And Douglas Crimp and other art historians have returned to Alvin Baltrop's work to look for this other world, another world from the 1970s, a world of cruising, a pre-Grindr world of desire. And while that's an interesting historical narrative, it is not the one that I look at. I'm looking in his work, and I'm only giving you one example of it in this image today, for these beautiful, stunning, grand images of collapse. And I'm asking in this section about these thinking about these photographs, not as documents of a past era of sexual cruising, but thinking of them as landscapes, landscapes in which architecture makes its gradual decline, its gradual decay down to the earth. I'm also asking about the erotics of decline, alternative masculinity, and what we might call detumescent architectures. Okay, next slide, please. All right, this is my second to last concept. In the 70s as well, and I wanted to think about the sonic a little bit in order to connect with some of Amer's work on abolitionary listening. And for anyone who's interested in listening, you will inevitably find your way to the work of Pauline Oliveros. And I think Pauline Oliveros' work is very useful within a politics of refusal, particularly in the terms that I've articulated it, a refusal of a kind of identitarian position, a refusal to cohere into sense making, a refusal of the logic of order, symmetry, harmony, and so on. Oliveros's sound experiments are deeply invested in what I'm going to call, for the keyword for this section, sonic chaos. And that sonic chaos, it doesn't mean that there's nothing in it but just blips of random sound. In fact, in some of the sound projects that Oliveros put together in the very early work that she did, not the later work on listening, but in the early experimental work that she put together, random sounds actually produced noises that were almost like communications from another world. And I wonder if you could just hit on the sound button in that slide for me, and we'll see if we can hear one of these experiments. Does it play? No? Oh, yeah. I can't hear you, actually.
I'm afraid it's not going to play, actually, the sound.
Wow. Okay. Then I'm going to see if I can play it, and I'll take an extra minute or two to do that, because that was why I sent it to you in advance. Not sure if I can get, however, to my keynote where I would have that. And let me see. Here we go. And I'm going to play this myself. Okay, what we were listening to was a piece called One of Four. It was an early tonal work generated by tape recorders, and you can come out of the slide now, please. And Oliveros created this with 12 sine wave generators, a keyboard, and a reverb unit. And you do get a kind of random layering of sound. But what she herself was surprised by was that in the middle of this set of electronically produced electrical waves that created sound, there's a kind of what she called a scream melody, and you could hear it in that high-pitched scream that emerges out of the sonic chaos, a scream melody that could be any piece of the material that she had mixed into the sound. It could have been bird song, insect noise, frogs, foghorns, animals in heat, whales conversing, bat echolocation, or some combination of the above. And when she played other pieces within the same project, other things emerged sort of unbidden. And so I'm quite interested in this sonic chaos that nonetheless produces unexpected forms of sound. Okay, last slide, please. And this is my last point. I wanted to close then by connecting to a piece by Amer that has been very important to me, which is called Refusing the World, Silence, Commoning, and the Anthropocene. And I find a connection here because one of the pieces of the archive of the 70s that I've been working with is a film by Marlene Goris called A Question of Silence. And silence is something that Amer has written about in really stunning and, to me, really exciting and inspirational ways. And this film, for those of you who don't remember, should be on everyone's radar at this moment when people like Veronica Gago from Argentina are trying to articulate an international feminist politics built around the general strike. In this film, 3 women who do not know each other go shopping, and this is set in Holland, enter a store where one woman is approached by the shopkeeper and accused of shoplifting. She turns around and begins to beat the the shopkeeper, and the other 2 women spontaneously join in the violence. And they kill this man and are put in jail and maintain complete silence about why they've done this. And so the film is called A Question of Silence, and it raises questions about a kind of spontaneous refusal of patriarchy, acts of violence that do not require, passionate contexts for their emergence, and are shrouded in a kind of silence that suggests that there is no way for these women to articulate the anger that spurs this act within the context of patriarchy. And that question of silence emerges as a kind of call for an urgent rearrangement of life, power, futurity, history, bodies, desire, and silence. And I want to end then with a quote from Amer's essay, where she writes, "The question of silence presents itself as an act of refusal and sabotage." And it's that version of silence with which I want to collaborate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jack. Okay, we'll hand over to Amer now, and I'll go back to the beginning. Does that suit you? And you can just tell me how you'd like me to proceed through the prompts or through the images.
I can't hear that.
I don't have audio right now for Amer.
Hi, sorry about that. There should be a title slide for mine, and then the slides will go through again with an addition of a few other slides in there. Yeah, you've got that? Great. Thanks. So before I begin, I just want to thank Nora and Elise, Rachel and Paul, and all the rest of the Transmedia LA team for pulling this together in such difficult times and circumstances. And I also want to thank my co-keynote, Jack, for the prompts around which we are going to be in dialogue. I begin today by situating myself where I am, because what connects all of these conversations we have about unworlding, refusal, you can put the slide back on, actually. I don't need to be seen. um, about unworlding, refusal, care, and geographies of scale are different ways for me of thinking and approaching how we relate to each other and to the worlds that we inhabit and that also inhabit us. So this for me means beginning with where I am, because where I am and how I came to be here is critical to understanding what otherwise or elsewhere might mean. So I am on the stolen lands of the Woiwurrung and Bunurong people of the East Kulin Nations in Naarm or Melbourne, Australia, and I pay my respects to the past and present elders of these lands and to the country on which I live itself. By speaking from where I am, a settler colonizer in a place where First Nations peoples are continually asserting their self-determination and sovereignty, and where colonization is deeply woven into the fabric of the nation state, I also want to consider these prompts or objects that Jack has brought into this talk tonight by attempting to widen the frame of our conversation. Can you move on to the next slide, please, Danny? So the first object that Jack sent me was an image of Adam Pendleton's 2019 painting, We Are Not. So firstly, I want to speak to an idea of refusal. And I also want to thread into this idea of an imagined collective, which I'll return to throughout the different objects as well. As I wrote in my piece for the Transmedia Ale Almanac, To Undo Nature on Refusal as Return, there's a common understanding of refusal as a pushing against, refusal as reactive or as a negation of something that is unbearable. There's been extensive, brilliant work written about refusal, particularly the refusal of state coercion and control over First Nations and Black communities, the no of refusal as a mode of survival, the refusal to be killed or assimilated, the Indigenous refusal of colonial recognition, the Black refusal of anti-Blackness, as Jack spoke about, white erasure and enclosure. And I strongly recommend looking to the work of scholars like Audra Simpson, Zoe Todd, Denise Ferreira da Silva, Sadia Hartman, Aileen Morton Robinson, and Linda Tuiwai-Smith for their brilliant insights into this. From my very brief understanding of Pendleton's work, this is also the first time that I've engaged with Pendleton's work, this is also a refusal that he speaks to in anti-racist and anti-capitalist movements, specifically in terms of Black aesthetics and politics. So outside the context of this work, I also want to open out what other understandings of refusal might bring, particularly when the focus of against or for is loosened and attention shifts from a turning away from to a turning towards. Pendleton says that in his work, Blackness is used as a fluid framing device. So it's this fluidity that I want to follow. In To Undo Nature and Refusal as Return, I played with an idea of refusal as return, or as a pouring back, a meaning found originally in Old Latin and lost over time. This is not a return to some idealized form or desire for a time before. It's not a primitivism as celebrated by Malthusian European nationalist and fascist claims to indigeneity over land and nature. And so I want to consider what happens when time is approached as nonlinear, as circular and overlapping, like tides, when refusal is not about fighting something fixed in the past or in the future, but recast into understanding the events of the world as always unfolding and interconnected and present. It becomes untethered from its anchoring in diametric opposition. We are not, or we are, is a collective identity dependent on a stable opposition. We are not gathers and encloses people out of necessity. The power of a shared identity is mobilized by both right and left-wing politics. Where I am, the we of colonial nationalism is used to justify the dispossession of land and the genocide of First Nations peoples through a modern white supremacist universal of citizenry. Any claim to unity without differentiation becomes quickly fixed. It loses what Clarissa Alvarez and Patero Kalule talk about as a rivering or a flow. But when opposition is dissolved, then the idea of a we who are or who are not is also changed. When the parameters for these boundaries become unstable, when there is no longer an exchange with the opposition, no desire for recognition from the opposition, then the we also collapses. That doesn't mean that what is left is nothing. Instead, what is left is unknown. There is an enormous power here, I think, in being unknown, and even more so in being unknowable. The nebulousness of being unknowable, crucially, I think, unfixes refusal. And it's important to give this some consideration because an oppositional and immutable refusal is not always the most radical gesture in all circumstances. Refusal can limit thought and imagination, and it's quite easy to think that the limits of my imagination can stand in for the limits of the world. The limitlessness, though, of what cannot be known, and also what is not mine to know, which I write extensively about in regards to listening, is worth pausing with. For conversations on unworlding or undoing, it could be that those things that cannot be captured or said might allow for movements to be made that have not even been conceived of yet. So that brings me to Jack's second object, Cal Flynn's Islands of Abandonment. So this theme of who or what is invoked in a collective humanity is also present for me in this second image, the cover of the book Islands of Abandonment by Cal Flynn. I have to confess, I have not actually read this book and have not had the opportunity to engage with it. So I'm speaking only to this title and what it raises for me in relation to the work that I do. And I also want to talk about scale and abandonment in this collective humanity with regards to this. So when I first came across this image last week, I immediately thought of the Anglo-European discourses around places like the Pacific and the Caribbean, places imagined as small, as Jamaica Kincaid might say, remote and uninhabitable, where peoples are forced to abandon their homes due to rising tides, cyclones, and droughts. Places that, as Zoe Todd talks about, get framed as case studies for catastrophe. What this case study framing does, argues Todd, is disconnect the place from its people and its kinships, its relations. This is a Western onto-epistemological separation that is wholly inappropriate, and I will explain this right now why. So could you go to the next slide, please? So on the 15th of January, the Hunga Haiapai submarine volcano in the South Pacific, located 65 kilometers north of Tonga Tapu, Tonga's main island, erupted. The eruption caused tsunamis in Tonga, Fiji, American Samoa, Vanuatu, and along the rim of the Pacific Ocean. At least 3 people were killed that we know of. Some were injured and many remain missing in Tonga from tsunami waves up to 15 meters high. Preliminary data showed that this was probably the largest volcanic eruption in the 21st century. In the days following, satellite images and videos, such as the one that we are looking at right now, circulated global media, a God's eye view that abstracted the viewer from the lives lived in its fallout. A view from above, a scalar distance, a distance of the over there that renders the over there peripheral. With this designation of periphery comes a designation of what can be abandoned. This is a colonial geopolitics, as many other writers have already said. There are, of course, however, other ways of making geographies and scales. Tongan and Fijian scholar Epeli Hauofa famously spoke about this, and I want to read his words at length because I think he says it best. So could you go to the next slide, please? So Epeli Hauofa writes, "The idea of smallness is relative. It depends on what is included and excluded in any calculation of size. Thus, when those who hail from continents or islands adjacent to continents, and the vast majority of human beings live in these regions, when they see a Polynesian or Micronesian island, they naturally pronounce it small or tiny. Their calculation is based entirely on the extent of the land surfaces that they see. But if we look at the myths, legends, and oral traditions, and the cosmologies of the peoples of Oceania, it will become evident that they did not conceive of their world in such microscopic proportions. Their universe comprised not only land surfaces, but the surrounding ocean as far as they could traverse and exploit it, the underworld with its fire-controlling and earth-shaking denizens, and the heavens above with their hierarchies of powerful gods and named stars and constellations that people could count on to guide their ways across the seas. There is a gulf of difference between viewing the Pacific as islands in a far sea and as a sea of islands. The first emphasizes dry surfaces in a vast ocean far from the centers of power. When you focus this way, you stress the smallness and remoteness of the islands. The second is a more holistic perspective in which things are seen in their totality of their relationships." When places where catastrophe strikes are seen outside of their kinships, their fluid boundaries and their relationships, there is a false disconnection. The consequent echoes of the eruption, the tsunami waves that caused 6,000 barrels of oil to tumble into the sea in Lima, Peru, the shockwaves felt in Portland, the giant waves in Venice, all show that the God's eye view is a lie. There are no places without people. The fantasy of a non-human life as segregated from human life is violent because it justifies abandonment. In the same way, the myth of the collective universal humanity erases as it assimilates. Those who fall out of the collective are left to die. Those left out are the same who are leveraged in Anthropocene discourses as collateral, as scholars including Leon Seeley Huggins and Angela Last, following Kamau Braithwaite, Amy Césaire, and Edward Glissant, speak about. The idea of the post-human, a better world, a world that is better without humans, enacts a fundamental catastrophic violence, to draw on Bedour Lagra, because the idea of man derived from the human, as Sylvia Wynter expounds, has always been based on anti-blackness and anti-indigeneity. The Anglo-European myth of the collective also labours the illusion that there is a shared culpability, a we who caused this and who suffer equally. This prohibits meaningful solidarity because the myth obfuscates which stakes are shared, how, and why. So we can move on to the next slide now. Alvin Beltrop's collapsed architecture. So the sharing of stakes emerged for me also in Jack's reading of the collapsed architectures of Alvin Beltrop's work in their talk for the Almanac on the aesthetics of collapse. What I found fascinating in Jack's reading was the foregrounding of interrelation, not only the interrelation between steel and wood, plasterboard and iron, their interplay with and dependence on the environment, the water, weather, light, air, salt, but also the intimacies these material relations afforded for those that sought refuge in them. Jack spoke of the intimacies made possible away from the control of the state, only possible in ruins at the ends of roads that had become unpassable. Physical and material ruins as enclaves that held within them the possibilities of mutual aid, pleasure, and care. So there is an argument that is often played out between those that advocate for hope and those who advocate for hopelessness. That to hope is to deny the grim realities of our time, that only some can afford hope, and that hopelessness is conformism and defeat. Another way of approaching this could be through understanding that life is lived regardless of either hope or hopelessness as a definitive stance. Life not lived as a refusal or in compliance, just lived, because that's what life does. And within this too, pleasure, joy and disappointment, pain and love, loss, rage and acceptance. The mundanities of living are so unprofound that they are often left unsaid. And it's in these mundanities I want to propose that refusal as return might find some space, because it is here that things are allowed to move beyond the limits of the imagination. Encounters and events are unseen and disregarded, not enough to be known, that require no validation or recognition beyond those who take part. So in that sense, life lived as a turning toward itself, without being defined necessarily in comparison to or against something else. This mundane life where everyday care and intimacy happens, the necessities for staying alive without fanfare or notice or theorization, makes me think of the acts of care between disabled and immunocompromised people in times of viral crisis. The context of HIV and communal care that Beltrop's work speaks to, and now in the time of COVID, that impacts Black and Indigenous communities, economically impoverished and disabled communities the hardest. These acts of care are not for anyone but those being cared for and those that are caring. They are not done only in refusal of the state or vaccine injustice, which leaves the majority of the world vulnerable, consolidating even more wealth and resource hoarding amongst imperial and colonial nations. They are done to stay alive. What these often unnamed acts of care enact is interdependence, not only of the need for the redistribution of resources and infrastructures and the commitment of energy, time, and attention, but the interdependence that bodies and environments have, the reliance on one another for life and in death. The Disability Justice Collective Sins Invalids say that interdependence is meeting one another's needs, with an understanding that the solutions offered by the state further extends the state control. And can you go to the next slide, please? Mia Mingus writes that interdependence is crucial to liberatory access, to undoing the myths of independence that prohibit people from understanding how interconnected all life is. For Mingus, interdependence, and I quote, understands that we are bound together by virtue of existing on this planet. Interdependence is generative and grounded in care for one another. It doesn't live in obligation or entitlement, but rather a loving willingness and a sacred giving. Interdependence cannot exist in scarcity, competition, comparison, domination, or greed. It flourishes in abundance, appreciating and honoring difference, collective care, and collective access. Interdependence can exist between 2 people or 6 billion and everything in between. So when I look at Baltrop's work, I think of the interdependence that exists there between the people and the place itself. There is precedence for this view of interdependence in the relational knowledges and practices of Black and First Nations communities. The separation of people from place and from each other is not innate, and it is in these moments where bodies are shown as reliant and always enmeshed with their environments and the futility of this separation where this becomes felt. This interdependence that undoes the myth of the individual and the universal collective resonates with this other conception of refusal as a folding in or circling back of bodies, energies, times, and geographies. And that brings me to the last object that I will speak to, which is Pauline Oliveros's One of Four, which you don't need to play again. So the refusal that I'm invoking here is an undoing towards something watery and unfixable, something without name or with a name that refuses to be thought. It's not a solution or an endpoint. It's not a suggestion for how the world is and how it can be done in other ways. It is simply not knowing. The final object I received from Jack was Pauline Oliveros's One of Four. Oliveros wrote, and I quote, that quantum listening is listening to more than one reality simultaneously. Avant-garde composers and musicians at the time of Oliveros scoured the everyday to find the edges of sound making, to make music without boundaries. But this refusal that is an undoing departs from the idealization of listening as the ability to attain thought of that which exceeds the limits of imagination, and in doing so is forever trapped within the limits of imagination. In Oliveros's early electronic compositions like this one, she believed that electronic sound creates an attention that is, and I quote, diffuse, open, and non-judgmental. I don't agree with her statement, not in terms of electronic musics, but in this attribution to listening and to attention. How Pauline Oliveros listened and attends to sound is not how I listen or attend to sound. How I listen is not always how I listen, and how I listen is not how you listen. There is no one way to listen. No one listening being and the injunction to listen, let alone to listen in a certain way, is an engulfing constraint, despite the gesture to diffusion. It drowns in its own horizon. In Abolitionary Listening, Propositions and Questions, Carson Cole Arthur, Patero Kalule, and myself speak to the understanding of listening and being listened to as a subject held by calculation and by law. Listening, like care, we write, is often invoked as a way of concern, of inclusion that unhumans as it claims to make human. The assertion that listening is always a gesture of generosity obfuscates that listening can also order, contain, and persecute. The kind of listening that Oliveros fantasizes about is a listening without a listening subject. There is no fleshy body here. This fantasy is underpinned by what Marie Thompson calls, and I quote, white orality, the assumption that listening is done by a benign, abstracted, and non-judgmental white ear. Deep listening, as it is widely conceived by white composers, is founded on separability, the listener from the one being listened to, despite intentions to interconnection. There is a lot to be said about how white avant-garde composers appropriated the cosmologies and beliefs of Black and First Nations peoples on listening and sound, and with little reflection on how these cosmologies are fundamentally incompatible with the Anglo-European onto-epistemological worldview, which is founded on separability. This separability creates an other that might be captured through listening. The movements of vibrations that comprise sound have no beginning and no end, no partitions or sections aside from what is arbitrarily imposed. These movements are, for Arthur, Kalule, and myself, conceived of as uncapturable, what can't be designated into thought or words. There is no meaning to be made here that is discrete and fixed. There is only the unknowable. Listening with the commitment to the uncapturable shakes free what listening might be thought to do or to offer. To move from separation to relation through attunement is what we refer to as an abolitionary listening, or as we state in the paper Abolitionary Listening, and I quote, a mode of listening that compels us to move out of the violent rubrics of human representation towards what Dion Brand calls another place, not here. This shifts away from the demands of doing things in a way that allows for claiming knowledge of them. There is a confrontation to the radical politics of refusal because it breaks from the centrality of representation as the axis for being in relation. There is no forcing here of presence, of resistance, of interpretation, of sense-making. There is no ideal listener who listens in ideal ways. This is a turning toward rather than a turning away from. It's not a denial of the systemic violence of the state and the material violence that kills certain lives with impunity. It is instead to attend to the ways that those left to die navigate life and care by turning toward, as Kalule puts it, elsewhere, rather than turning away from what seeks to destroy them. And I want to end here with the last few points of abolitionary listening propositions and questions, because I think this best articulates what I'm moving to. So can you move it to the last slide, please? Perhaps it is more akin to sitting with listening as a turning towards, more than a turning away from, a kind of intervallic attunement that can find itself within unknowability, embracing the feeling of unknowability as a non-horizon. We cannot and will not try to delimit what this listening gathers, what it might look like or feel like. It is here and yet not here. It is present, it is remembered, but also yet to come. Again, we will not master the representational. We will not represent representation nor misrepresentation. We will not issue a judgment. To listen as such is to make way for the incommensurable, an absolute difference that cannot be assimilated, which flourishes precisely in its alterity. This invites letting go of comparison and the search for conclusion. But one can't talk about listening. One simply does it somehow. Listening stops the moment we mark limits, the moment we think we know exactly what it is. Thanks.
Thank you so much, both of you, for your presentation. So we have a little bit of time left now for discussions and some Q&A, maybe from the Telegram group. I kind of wanted to jump in, I guess, with a question that I had from sort of engaging with your talk here, but also kind of prior to the live presentations today. So I guess both of your presentations are maybe dealing with different kinds of embodied refusals. So Jack, for example, explored acts of human or non-human unworlding, that through things like you used concepts like negation, abandonment, collapse, sonic chaos in these different examples from photography, choreography, music, sound art, that they resisted somehow maybe then world building valuation. And Amer, then you're exploring listening as a political act and also as a form of refusal. And I loved, and actually I used it in the opening kind of introduction today. I loved your use of the concept of refusal, not as a sort of a negation or not as a no, but as a return. You're both touching on ruins or collapse as spaces for quite pragmatic forms of mutual aid. But, acknowledging that those are spaces of sheer necessity often or compromise. So they're not being romanticized necessarily. And I guess you're both looking also at art as a space of entanglement for disrupting the human and the non-human, figure and ground, knowing and unknowing. And that's where my question really was coming to. So I was thinking about actually a panel that was in Transmediale in 2020, actually, so right before the pandemic hit, called States of Entanglement. And it had a really, really great presentation by an author called Eva Giraud, who's written a really interesting book called What Comes After Entanglement. And it's quite a provocative work. So she's sort of asking, I guess, whether entanglement also displaces responsibility. So by decentering humans, maybe do we no longer have to acknowledge our own culpability? Does entanglement maybe encode a kind of structurelessness that glosses over implicit and very still present hierarchies? where we end up in this kind of morally ambiguous space, basically, where structuralist allows for power structures to flourish unchecked in a kind of, oh, it's so complicated way. And I guess I had a similar maybe response to sort of thinking about some of the sort of practices then of listening or noise, that we were engaging with today, and I suppose how useful maybe some of your theories, Amer, of kind of maybe like white orality, Thompson's theory that you're using are for maybe troubling some of these ideas. So I'm wondering, do we need to further interrogate then the model of noise that's being produced in the work of artists like Pauline Oliveros or John Cage, for example? And I think this is something, Amer, that you've gestured to when you speak of the proper subject of listening and Thompson's white orality, that these are maybe composers that are operating in a space where race or sexuality, gender and class don't really exist. And maybe that's maybe a case kind of to be made for Cage. But yeah, I guess I kind of wondered whether both of you had sort of thoughts about that, and then did you maybe have other sort of examples then of artists who are proposing sort of models of sonic chaos, maybe that aren't kind of presuming a kind of a universal sort of listening subject?
Jack, would you like to go first?
I can. I think that's more of a question for Amer. Obviously, much of what has been discussed in terms of the politics of listening and deep listening has returned recently to Pauline Oliveros, who both is and is not part of that white avant-garde. She collaborated with Cunningham and Cage at various times, but it has in no way been incorporated into that white avant-garde canon in the way that her gay male counterparts were. And in fact, one of the disruptive elements of her production was that she was producing this experimental noise at a time when women's music had been associated with deeply harmonic, very moralistic forms of the political that she found herself outside of. And she resisted and refused various invitations to participate in women's music festivals for that reason. So I think, I'm not completely sure that Oliveros fits in the way that Amer is placing her. I think that, Amer is also calling for a kind of non-judgmental listening that doesn't have a trajectory in mind, which is very clearly also part of the Oliveros practice. And I guess my question for Amer is, there are a couple of times in the presentation where we're called upon by you to, instead of, as part of an ethos of refusal, to not have a trajectory for our political mission, to not, think about the what's the motivation for a particular practice. You argue for just living. And then when we get to the listening section, it's an argument for just listening. And just as you said, there is no place that is not, occupied by the human, even places that have been abandoned, which I think is a great point, and I really want to think about that. There is no such thing as just living or just listening. Like, what would be the space in which someone is just being? Where is that? What is that? So the just gives me pause.
Yeah, absolutely. Nothing that I'm talking about is easy or easily solved. Most of the work that I grapple with is entirely mired in exactly this kind of complexity. I in no way advocate for an idea of a kind of formless nothing, not nothingness is the wrong word to use, but a kind of formless, throwing up hands of any kind of idea of politics or anything like that. I think what I'm more concerned about is the kind of rigidity or the stagnation that comes with the rigidity of fixed positions, And I think, Jack, that's something that you talk about yourself quite a bit as well. I think that there's quite a danger in that. With regard to the work of Pauline Oliveros, I mean, I've been sitting with her work, obviously, as a sound artist and a composer for quite some time, I think, coming up to 2 decades now. So, I mean, I guess what is very clear to me, like especially working with listening and especially as well, with working on listening with the people that I collaborate with, what I did become very aware of very rapidly is the way that particular white avant-garde composers, and I do include Pauline Oliveros in this as well because she's a white avant-garde composer. She has done many, many interesting and fabulous works, but that remains that at a particular time, there was not much engagement with how those ideas did appropriate Indigenous cosmologies and Black cosmologies without any kind of, citation, without any kind of like material engagement as well with the cosmologies that were being drawn from. And I think it's very, very easy, with a lot of these composers to kind of look at the ways that they moved listening and sound into particular kinds of directions without kind of thinking about exactly what Marie Thompson talks about as white orality. And there is absolutely brilliant work being done in sound studies and ethnomusicology precisely on these kinds of areas of inquiry, So nothing that I'm saying about Pauline here is in any way like new or hasn't already been said. Like this is a very active discourse that is being had, and has been being had for quite a while. So, but I think there is a difference between what I'm saying and as I said, this kind of, a particular idea of entanglement or everything just kind of falls together, because I am also talking about differentiation, and I think what is more interesting to me is looking, especially in the work that I've done, like with people from all across like Oceania and the Pacific and things like that, understanding that particular conceptions that we have of politics or particular conceptions that come from Anglo-European understandings and philosophies of nature and the human and politics and things like that are simply not appropriate and simply just do not work in so many other places, and I think that's something that I'm really, really interested in when I'm thinking about differentiation, is what actually makes sense for the context that we're talking about, and when I do say as well, like just living, particularly in with regard to immune compromised and disabled people within the pandemic right now, and talking about care as well, as not really about refusal or about this or about that, it is actually sometimes just staying alive, and I think that just does a lot of work there, because the just is actually enormous. It's a huge excess, and sometimes I think it is important to kind of allow that to be there as well.
Yeah, and I guess to go back to the question, one thing that I would say as an example of a different kind of noise making and listening that has a different resonance, I would refer people to Ana Maria Ochoa Gautier's book, Orality. And the subtitle is Listening and Knowledge in 19th Century Colombia, where she records the way in which forms of noise making, like howls and pitches that came from native peoples, were read by colonial settlers as, evidence of the primitive nature of the peoples that they had come to conquer, when in fact there are all kinds of forms of communication that were going on through these howls and yelps and so on. So I think that what can be, as Amer is saying, what can be aestheticized into something like sonic chaos can also in other contexts be forms of anti-colonial communication. And we also have to pay attention to this schema within which noise making has been opposed, as Jacques Attali and other people have said, to music, and noise making is a way in which people have not mastered sound enough to produce meaning. And that is a script that is, utterly part of a colonial worldview.
So there's a question here on the Telegram about listening, but I also have a question about listening, so I'm going to fold them together. I remember a couple of years ago I was asked to do a conversation with Brandon LaBelle on a book he'd just written about the politics of sound, and one of the kind of practical examples I think in the book that he had of sound as political was this moment where Haitian slaves, seeing the French Navy, kind of seeing the French boats approaching during the Revolution, sang the Martinique back, so they sang the Song of Revolution back basically to the colonizers. And it's a wonderful example of this sort of politics of sound or noise making. But the question I was sort of left with is a lot of these, examples that we have in audio cultures are often, they're about the sort of appearance or the voice. They're about producing sound, and I guess like what is a this is probably a way too broad question, but like what does the politics of listening look like when so many of our ideas of politics are based on voice or based on appearance? The only example I could think of was that there's this lovely paper from, I think, 1984 by Ray Chow, where she talks about Walkman use in communist China. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but she sort of talks about this moment of this sort of listening as kind of a refusal. But I wondered, if you had thoughts on, like, what does a politics of listening look like? Similarly, we have a question here from Grook who says, maybe how could we practice quantum listening? I don't know, can we fold these two together? But yeah.
I think, I'm actually going to shamelessly plug two books, which are absolutely not mine, but which are really brilliant, and they happen to be sitting right next to me to really think about this, actually. The first is Dylan Robinson's Hungry Listening, which is a fantastic, fantastic book. He goes very extensively, I think in a way that I have not encountered before, very extensively through what a settler colonizer listening position is, and also what it means to listen to Indigenous sound, Indigenous and First Nations sound. And he really talks about the kinds of desires of settler colonized listening to absorb and assimilate and make sense of Indigenous sound in particular ways. I think one of the opening quotes is he talks about when R. Murray Schafer, who is a very famous acoustic ecologist and, very much tied in this particular kind of era of sound, as well as Pauline and John Cage and other white avant-garde North American sound makers, was comparing Inuit singing to Winston Churchill clearing his throat, like the sound of Winston Churchill clearing his throat, right? And so I think, for anybody that is interested in really thinking about this kind of idea of listening and also understanding how listeners from different positions and in different moments and spaces listen, I think Robinson's book is a really integral book to read on that, because he goes over it really, really well. Another book that I have here that is also a brilliant book, it's by the Gaywu group of women called Song Spirals. And I'll show it here. It's a brilliant book that came out as well a couple of years ago here, which was written by Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal women and writers writing about the place of sound and listening and land, relationships to country here in so-called Australia. And I think both of these books kind of really unsettle this particular idea of listening and deep listening. I mean, the other thing is, also here, as I'm sure across many other settler colonizer nations and many other places, there are already very strong First Nations philosophies around listening and place that, again, find their way. This is what I'm talking about, finding their way into work like Pauline Oliveros's deep listening, but without being cited and without kind of being explicitly situated and drawn upon. So, yeah, I would say if people are interested in that, to really go and get those two books and have a look at what those authors have to say, because they say it quite beautifully.
Fantastic. Jack, I don't know, do you want to say anything to that? Well, actually, we have about. Thank you. We have about, I think, 3 minutes left on our time, and there's a question on the Telegram, which I'm presuming is maybe for Jack and relates to your first slide, where Caroline Ward is asking, could you say more on blackness and where you are coming from with that?
Okay, that's very broad. I'm trying to make clear that the politics of negation with which I began, a politics that wants to turn to a different vocabulary, isn't just coming from a kind of some open, unmoored place of rebellion, but is actually comes out with it out from a deep engagement with a certain strand of Black studies, within which world, if I'm talking about unworlding, as Amer's presentation made clear, there's already a presumption of what world is. And of course, world is part of a colonial understanding of terrain, peoples, rule, governance. And world is also, as Amer's presentation made clear, a fictional staging of a we, of a commons, of some group of people who believe we are the world. And so unworlding is necessarily part of a deconstructive script coming out of Black studies. And Amer gave us some of the main players to whom we would need to turn in order to think unworlding differently. And that would be Sylvia Wynter, Saidiya Hartman, Christina Sharp, Aimé Césaire, and so on. I mean, where am I coming from? I'm coming from a place of having understood that talking about unworlding has to begin with, rather than move towards, an anti-racist position articulated by Black scholars who are deeply invested in the potentiality and politics of negation.
Thank you so much. I think we are basically at time. So unless, Amer, if you have any kind of closing comments you'd like to make, or Jack? Okay, well then I'd like to thank you both very, very much for your generous contributions today and for the discussion. Jack, Amer, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Danny. And thank you so much, Jack, for your objects. They were really a pleasure to work with.
It was. I hope we get to do this in person sometime, Amer. This was really amazing and I learned a lot. I really thank you.